take a look at other regions in the world, and just very briefly, there's a lot going on in the world of cannabis legalization around the world. Some jurisdictions are still very much controlled and have, at least at this point, are saying absolutely we will never legalize this plant, and other jurisdictions are, sort of following Canada's lead and moving forward with that. So I want to take us backwards again, if we go into the US, back to the early 1930s. Now, cannabis was not outlawed in the United States until 1937. So that was well over 10 years past Canadian prohibition started. But what happened in the States is some of the states started kind of buckling down on that, and then finally in 1937, federally it became a restricted drug. But in the meantime, they had this crazy propaganda machine that started in the 1930s. It started with a church group, well-meaning church group, that wanted to keep this what was thought at the time to be this dangerous, harmful drug away from children and youth. And so they started this big propaganda, basically a propaganda machine, because it stuck up until this day. I still have people of some of the older generation who are kind of parroting that propaganda back to me when they find out what I do for a living. So it was called the Reefer Madness. And there's actual movie about Reefer Madness. So there was movies and posters and public disinformation campaign, really to scare people into believing that this was a dangerous and harmful drug that was going to kill all of our children or turn our children into murderers and rapists and those kinds of things. It was a huge propaganda machine. There was a movie that was made by this church group that later got taken over by the federal government and called Reefer Madness. That is in the public domain now. You can go onto YouTube and watch the Reefer Madness campaign. It's black and white, it's silly, and it's now become sort of this cult movie that people love to get stoned and watch because it's actually pretty funny how they portray cannabis users completely out of character to what reality is. So if you want to go watch that, I highly recommend you go onto YouTube and look up Reefer Madness, and you can watch the full movie on there. This whole campaign, based on a lot of racism, based on a lot of fear and control, and it's sort of coming out of those puritanical days of everything had to be prim and proper. We have to remember that alcohol was prohibited in the 1930s as well. So there was really this move in the 1920s and 30s to try and sort of purify society and, make everybody to be prim and proper. Obviously, that didn't work so well, but that campaign kind of persists today. So by the 1970s, that I said, this campaign sort of became, it was started to be mocked, and actually was being turned around by the youth of the 60s, and that counterculture movement was kind of starting to use this movie as a way of showing just how ridiculous propaganda that was. I think it's a really good lesson for today to understand that propaganda works, because we have a couple of generations who were indoctrinated into this propaganda. And still to this day, like I have people who are sort of in their like the kind of early baby boomers who have said to me, I remember one person expressing some concern to me that when cannabis was become legalized, there was going to be all these high-speed crashes and so many people were going to die and the roads would become dangerous because everyone's going to be stoned on them. And I remember looking at it, like, oh yeah, you're pretty indoctrinated into the Reefer Madness campaign. Like, propaganda works. And so my reply was, yeah, there might be a few accidents, but they're going to be slow rolls into a ditch. They're not going to be high-speed crashes, because anyone who understands how cannabis affects the body knows that it's quite the opposite from how alcohol affects the body. So that's a good lesson for today. Propaganda works, and I think we all have to be alert to the fact that our ideas and our belief systems are quite easily manipulated by things that are going on within the media. So let's go back to pre-prohibition in the United States. Both hemp growing was both encouraged and legislated, that farmers in the United States grow hemp. We talked about George Washington having hemp plantations back then. And because it was a really important part of society, it was an important part of creating tools and fabric and rope and food for the people. So up until the late 1800s, early 1900s, again, those attitudes had started to change about this plant. Some of that propaganda was starting to pop up. And just like in Canada, we had some of the racism against immigrants from Asia. And in the United States, they started to have issues with immigrants from Mexico coming up across the southern border of the United States. After the Mexican Revolution, there was a lot of Mexicans that started kind of moving into the United States, trying to have, create a new life for themselves. And as we talked about earlier, like any culture coming in, you know, when they move, they bring their culture with them. So the Mexicans would use cannabis in the same way that we use alcohol, like beer and wine. So it seems pretty, pretty innocent within their society. But again, all that racism, you know, these immigrants are taking our jobs, and they bring with us, they bring with them this product, this plant that's making them be stoned. And then our youth are starting to get their hands on that, and they're wanting to sort of have this free culture. And the Puritanican attitude of the day didn't like that. Things seemed like they were getting a little bit out of control. So same issue that was happening in Canada in the early 1900s was kind of starting to happen in the US in the 1930s. And so that basically led to, for the same reasons that happened in Canada, led to the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, and that basically criminalized possession of cannabis at that time. In 1944, there was a report, just as there were reports in Canada. The LaGuardia report of 1944 attempted to reverse that propaganda, stating that cannabis did not induce violence, it did not create insanity or sex crimes or lead to addiction or other drug use. And that was an interesting time, because there was these opposing forces, opposing political forces that were happening then. Of course, during the Prohibition in 1937, hemp was no longer allowed to be grown in the United States, so they lost out on one of their cash crops. But then when World War II happened, all of a sudden they needed those raw ingredients again to create products and textiles for the war effort. And actually, farmers in the United States were actually required again to devote a certain amount of their fields to growing hemp that would then be put into the war effort. And there was this big campaign by the US federal government called Hemp for Victory. Now, it's interesting that at some point the federal government denied that they actually created this whole documentary called Hemp for Victory. And again, if you want to go onto YouTube and search for Hemp for Victory, you can see that little short documentary that's on there. At one time in not so recent future, or not so distant future, the federal government vehemently denied that they created that that documentary. And so it took some people to go into the archives and searching to see if they could find evidence that in fact it was created by the federal government. And they finally found evidence of that in a dusty old corner of the archives. And so that could no longer be denied by the federal government that they had a part in the Hemp for Victory campaign. So during World War II, there was an exception made. You could go get a license, or you were given a license if you were a farmer to grow hemp. And then as soon as the war was over, it's like, hey, you better rip all those hemp plants out because it's illegal again. So interesting times how those laws were sort of manipulated a little bit in order to manage what was required during the war effort there. So just like in the around the world, the 1960s counterculture movement was starting to happen. Of course, the U.S. got embroiled in that very long, arduous war with Vietnam. The youth didn't want to be sent over to be killed like so many of their peers had happened to them. And so, part of that peace, love, rock and roll, cannabis was a big part of that. And so they're really pushing back up against those laws. Unfortunately, what happened during that time is during this 1970s, the Drug Enforcement Agency was created, and a new propaganda effort started to happen to demonize cannabis. And that's where we got the start of this war on drugs that has been, decades long war on drugs that has really not gone anywhere at all, except to ruin a lot of people's lives just for simple possession. They ended up getting put in jail for, 5 years, 10 years, sometimes for life, just for simple possession. So it's ruined a lot of people's lives. There's a whole interesting subject if you wanted to go down that road of what they call the school to prison pipeline, how they're setting people up, especially minorities up for, going right into the prison system. And then in the United States, the prison system is a for-profit prison. So there's a lot of really sketchy things going on about that. And in order to have for-profit prisons, which is basically slave labor, you have to have a steady supply of people going into being put into these prisons. So that's a whole other subject. I won't go into that now, but if that interests you, I really encourage you to go look into that. It's fascinating and it's terrifying as well. And I think a lot of the public is starting to sort of wake up to what's going on in that system. Let's get back to cannabis. Okay. So we've got this war on drugs starting to go on. We've got the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, is in full-on cracking down on cannabis and other drug use. President Nixon, President Bush Sr. are both really putting harsher and harsher penalties on this in order to try and curb its use. Life sentences for drug possession. Finally, California just said, this is really silly. In 1996, California legalized cannabis for medical use. Now, this was a really interesting time because the state laws could still be overruled by the federal laws. And by saying that it was just for medical purposes, that sort of helped to curb it a little bit, but there was no doctor intervention in that. Like it was still kind of a little bit, didn't have a lot of rules around it. And you hear stories back then about people who were growers and growing medicine and creating medical products, maybe brownies or cookies, those kinds of things for people who had chemo or had other kind of major health issues. And then in order to deliver it to them, they would have to, they would put it under the rock on the side of the highway. And then, they'd kind of drop off the delivery in the middle of the night. And then, someone who was delivering it to the person who was ill would kind of pick it up in the middle of the night. So it was still a really sketchy, difficult time for people trying to obtain legal cannabis for medical purposes. In 2012, both Colorado and Washington State became the first two states to legalize it, and that was for medical reasons and recreational purposes. So Colorado kind of took off with that a little bit faster than Washington did, and so that's why Colorado's kind of quite a bit ahead of all the states. And when Canada was looking at how can we roll out recreational cannabis, a lot of the legislators actually went down and spent some time in Colorado and see what was working, what wasn't working, and see if they could kind of fix some of the mistakes that had been made in Colorado. To date, there's various laws across the states for both medical and recreational use. Of course, at any time, federal law could come in and shut down dispensaries and grow ops in the states. And so, again, that's still an ongoing debate down there. But more and more states are coming on board, at least for medical cannabis, and then some of them for recreational as well. So Cannabis is still considered a Schedule I drug in the United States. It's under Federal Controlled Substances Act of 1970. So anything over 0.3% THC is considered a Schedule I drug. And they are still claiming that cannabis has no accepted medical use and has a high potential for abuse and physical or psychological dependence. So that propaganda is still pushing on. They're still reluctant down there to admit that there are some medicinal benefits to this cannabis. Doesn't matter how much lobbying is done and how many states actually open things up. So Uruguay was the first country to legalize cannabis for both recreational and medicinal purposes. They were leaders in the world. How it rolled out was, a little clumsy, but they did it. And that was in 2013 is when that came about. Citizens can grow up to 6 plants, so a little bit more than we can grow here in Canada. But they do have the THC capped at 9%, where in Canada we have the cap at 30%. So very low amounts of THC. It can only be purchased at government-run pharmacies. So they can't open up stores that are dedicated to cannabis use. You have to go buy it from a pharmacy. And the one thing is that I think Canada has done really well is the lab testing. So through the lab testing in Canada, we look for any contaminants from environment or in the growing or in the processing. And we also test for the cannabinoid levels, specifically THC and CBD. And that is not required in Uruguay, so you don't really know what you're getting with your product. Kind of goes back to the old days of buying a baggie. You're kind of dependent on your first use of it to know how strong it is, or whether it's going to wake you up or whether it's going to put you to sleep. So, but Uruguay, good for them. They kind of started the ball rolling there, and Canada came pretty close on their tail there. Now, the Netherlands, everyone thinks that cannabis has been legal in the Netherlands forever. It hasn't. It's an interesting place. So they have always had a fairly high tolerance for personal use, but it's never been decriminalized. So you could still be charged. In 1970, or since 1972, if you have 5 grams or less, it was just considered a misdemeanor, so you wouldn't really get charged. But anything more than 5 grams that you were carrying on you, you could definitely be charged, get criminal charges for that. Growing up to 5 plants has always been tolerated, and medical use of cannabis has been legal since about 2003. So a couple years after Canada kind of began the process down the medical path. The difference with the Netherlands is they have these places called coffee shops. Now, it's not coffee shop the way we have coffee shops up here. They've kind of put those two words together. So what we call dispensaries here are called coffee shops. Now, you can get a cup of coffee at these places, but it's more about those are where you buy your cannabis products. I've never been to Holland at all, but I have friends who've gone there, and they've gone to some of these coffee shops to purchase their cannabis. For tourists, it's really expensive, 2 to 3 times more than if you're a citizen there. You could get your products at a lot less money. So that's an interesting thing to be aware of if you do go traveling over to places like Amsterdam. Like here in Canada, there's age restrictions on who can come and go. You can't, these coffee shops cannot also sell alcohol in the same place that they sell cannabis. And there's restriction and controls around signage and marketing in the same way that we have here. We can't sort of advertise on TV or have big billboards up of somebody smoking a joint. So there's, there's kind of this hybrid that's going on in the Netherlands right now. But really it's their tolerance since the 70s of cannabis use that's kind of given them the reputation. So, status around the world. As of 2019, medically legal in several countries, and more are coming on board or in the process of getting medical cannabis legalized. So that's kind of the first step that countries go through, because with medical cannabis, you can have it somewhat controlled through your healthcare professionals. And then for recreational, either decriminalized or some sort of regulations around using it in the same way that we would use alcohol. We have quite a few less countries that have now legalized that. But again, more and more are coming on board. So that was a big module on regulation of cannabis in Canada, and we took a little bit of glimpse around the world. It's been a long, strange path of our sort of 90-year prohibition, this little blip. I believe that as we kind of work things through and the propaganda, the people that have that belief system of the propaganda, sort of their ideas start to expand a little bit. We realize that we're not harming society by having some legalization of this plant in place. I believe we're just sort of moving on, and this will become some weird blip in history in the same way that alcohol prohibition was just this weird short-term blip in history. And hopefully, especially with the environmental issues that we have going on here now on the planet, is we can start to use cannabis and hemp to start to solve those in a much more environmentally friendly way without giving up some of the sort of strides that we have in convenience for the society as we go today. So it's a long, strange road, and I think we have lots of strange paths ahead of us with this amazing plant. But this plant has been with us since forever, and it will continue to be with us forever. So yeah, that's regulation of cannabis.